This was quite a breakthrough, because there's such a long history of people saying, especially economists saying, don't ever give anything free, because if you give people things that are free, then they don't value it. Turns out, could be true, just doesn't happen to be true. That's why the point about behavioral assumptions that we make as economists are often not tested. We assume that that's how people must behave, and then it turns out some reason they don't. But it matters that they don't, because the world then functions differently. I'm going to skip this bit. So let me come to the so point number one I wanted to make is that there are lots of questions which we would like to know the answer to, which we can't just go from general principles. We did not know what would happen if we gave the bed nets free, because we had theories told us one thing, turned out the world was different. So one reason for us to try to evaluate is because we don't know the answer. Now, within evaluation, now I want to come to a narrower question, which is, why do we do these experiments? And I think there are really three answers to that question. So you could say, well, there are always experiments, as in the world there are always experiments. They're not structured experiments like the one I described, but they're experiments, so why do we need experiments with a capital E? Now, first reason is the one that is often adduced. I think this is the least important of the reasons in some ways. I think the usual argument is the reason why you want to experiment, and it's a perfectly good reason, I'm not saying it's wrong, is that if I just go to a school and I look at a school that has a blackboard and I compare the children there with school where there is no blackboard, I'm going to get the wrong answer for sure. Why? Because there are all kinds of reasons why the school with the blackboard, it has the blackboard. It's this, parents are richer, the families care more about education, they might be in a more urban location. All kinds of reasons why I'll get the difference between these would not be a good measure of the difference effect of a blackboard. So that's the standard argument that selection is very important in non-experimental data, and I think there are of course things you can do. There's a whole field of econometrics which is essentially trying to say we can do many things to fix this problem. And that's true, but it gets really complicated, and it gets complicated to the point where when you try to explain to the policymakers that this is why you should do this rather than that, their eyes glaze over quite fast. I mean, one advantage of experiments is that they are pretty transparent. You can see what the comparison was. So I think it does have some advantages in terms of credibility. But let me make the point that's a point that was often made. I want to make a different point. So I think a second reason why we do experiments is because we control what we are doing, and that's very important in the following sense. Suppose I wanted to know the effect of a particular schooling, what's the first? Let me start. Let's say I wanted to know the effect of particular program, Operation Blackboard, which was a large program that Rajiv Gandhi initiated in the 80s. It was a very large program. It involved many different interventions. Now, when I look at, suppose I could compare schools which got Operation Blackboard, benefited from Operation Blackboard, and schools that didn't. And I found the schools that got something from Operation Blackboard were doing better. That would be useful, but it won't tell us which piece of Operation Blackboard was useful. So it might be that you hired teachers, you trained teachers, you put up blackboards, you painted the schools, you built some toilets. So among all those things, which is the useful bit? One advantage of experiments is that experiments are tailored to the intervention. So if I wanted to know what is the effect of blackboards, I could just vary blackboards. If I look at history is never going to come in convenient packages like that. It's never going to be the case that, I'll see one set of schools which have just blackboards, another set of schools which have just a teacher training, a third set of schools that have just toilets. So the fact that they come unpacked, they come packed together in most observational data means that we typically cannot answer the question which particular piece of this intervention work. One nice thing about experiments is that I can vary the intervention itself. I can choose what I'm doing. If I am doing the one I'm randomly choosing schools and I'm giving them a blackboard, then I control it. A related point is that, therefore, when I'm evaluating a policy, another advantage of an experiment is that I assign the experiment. So when I look at observational data, it may well be that, when I compare this district with this other district, this district has more schools with let's say, blackboards, but that's true on average, but I don't actually, to identify specifically which schools I can compare with which other schools, I may not know which are the set of specific schools which are comparable to these schools which don't have blackboards. So by the time I figure that out, it's probably, 5 years after the program was launched, I have some amount of, historical data, but I don't get to choose the data I use in any of this. One nice thing about experiments is that I get to choose the data, because once I'm sending the blackboard to some schools, I can also know where to collect data. Why is that important? It's important because I can then pick what data I want to collect. Why is that important? It's important because then I can be quite creative about the data I collect. If I was going to collect data, so mostly when I look at what happened in history, I rely on data that somebody has collected for some general purpose. Those purposes are often, the NSS collects data. NSS doesn't collect data because I'm interested in some specific thing. It tries to collect a broad set of indicators which are useful, but that's very different from collecting data on something that I really want to know. Now, one nice thing about knowing what I want to know is that I can go collect data that's going to be far more sophisticated on the questions of interest. So what's an example of that? An example of that is that we did this study in Rajasthan on police reform. So we were interested in whether people are willing to register crimes. So, one reason why police departments typically don't like registering crime. If you go to do an FIR, they tell you, well, why bother? You'll never find him. They try to discourage you. Why do they try to discourage you? Police departments are usually evaluated by the ratio of crimes solved. So that since they don't want to solve crimes, they tend to want to reduce the denominator, which is the number of crimes registered. So that's a standard problem we have. So, but how do you know that they're not willing to do that? Well, in this particular case, precisely because we had randomized and we knew exactly where the police stations where we wanted to see the effect was, we had a bunch of interventions. We sent people who were pretending, we were working in the police department, so we were allowed to do this, we were pretending to register crimes. So they would show up in a police station and say, oh, my bicycle got stolen, or a girl would show up and say that, somebody was harassing me. And then they would see if the police were going to register the crime. If they were going to register it, then they would reveal themselves and say, no, that's not actually a real crime. And that would be, because that was with the police department, that was not, they didn't get punished for doing that. So as a result, we could discover about half the complaints were registered, and almost nothing affected that. However, again, this is an advantage of the experiment, we realized that some people were actually talking about it. So there would be, if I was sitting in a police station A, and one of these decoys that showed up in police station B people would be talking on the radios. They would be, and you would hear, this guy showed up in my police station, and he was this decoy sent by the people in Jaipur. Did you know that? So we realized that they were very interested in this. So we started sending decoys randomly. So if we would send one decoy to one place, 3 decoys to a different place, 5 decoys to a different place, and it turns out that that is a very powerful intervention. It turns out that as soon as you start doing this, the police station actually starts sort of recording the FIR. So we actually, in this process, precisely because we could see what the intervention was, this was not historical data, we could actually manipulate the process, and we could see that actually the best way to get police stations to register crimes turns out to be if you send these decoys to these places, then you can give them incentives. Every visit increases the probability of FIR registration by 4%. So it's extremely cheap way to increase registration. Last point I wanted to make on this question, and then I want to move on to the last bit of what I want to say. Am I out of time? No, not yet. So I have another 15 minutes at least. I don't know.
You've got half an hour more.
Oh, I think I'm going to take 15 minutes, whether or not I have it. So the third answer I wanted to give to, just to recap, why do these experiments? Why am I insisting that we should do experiments, actual social experiments? So first answer was that it gives us the right answer. There's no selection bias. Second answer is that it actually allows us to design what we want to do and what data we want to collect. It's not a matter of, so the intervention, the fact that we control the intervention and we control the data collection is extremely important, because then that changes what we can learn. Our ambition in terms of what data we collect and what interventions we make goes up a lot. The third answer is that we can design to test very specific hypotheses. This point I already made, but I want to come to an illustration of why that's very powerful. So one issue that looms large, especially in Africa, not so much in India, is people not using fertilizer. In India, we kind of have the opposite problem in some places, but in Africa at least, there's been this talk of why they need a green revolution, that they are not using fertilizer. Now, it's puzzling, because fertilizer is well known. Everybody knows fertilizer. You talk to them, nobody says what's fertilizer. It's claimed that it's high returns, and in fact, first thing we did was we actually gave a bunch of the farmers a little gift of fertilizer, so that they could actually try it out and see what the returns were. And the returns were on average 150%. 1 rupee generated 2 rupees 50 paisa in returns. So huge returns on fertilizer, and it's very divisible. So you don't need to, fertilizer is not something that you need to spend a lot of money on. If you wanted, you could do it on, a meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, and you still get returns. So it's very divisible. So it's not a matter of, I need to invest, $500 or 5,000 Kenyan shillings or something. You could invest very little into it. So why don't people do it? And basically people have been, when you ask them, one answer is that these people, they can't use the fertilizer. They are, it's good for people in the lab, but not for real people. Second answer, they don't know about it. Third answer, they don't have enough money. So one the question I want, they're not tied to historical data. So I can, if what happened in history, a few things happened in history, there were many things possible. In an experiment, what I can do is I can choose, if I think there are many things possible and interesting, I can choose all the things I think are interesting separately. That's, I think, that's probably the most powerful thing about experiments, is I can choose them separately. So one of the things that this set of papers did was basically, let's investigate one by one each of these things, and we'll keep going till we get the answer. We're not going to say, that this is something, some abiding puzzle. We're going to just go down and keep trying things till we figure out what works. How can we get people to take up fertilizer, and why don't they take it up otherwise? So the first one I already described. They did the first intervention was to give people fertilizer. A certain random set of people got fertilizer. They compared those people with other people, and output went up. Output went up uniformly everywhere between, I think, 72% and 200% returns. So it was very, very profitable. Second question: did they know about it? Well, sorry. So there was how do you one other second question, do they know about it? So, well, the people who got the fertilizer, who were randomly gifted fertilizer, they clearly know about it. I mean, how could they not know about it? They've used it, they got the money. So they already profited from it. So if you have used fertilizer already and you have profited from it, do you use it again? Turns out very few people do. So next, if you look at when you give people fertilizer, everybody uses it. Wait a year, compare these people with other people, there's a 10% difference in fertilizer use. So it's not as if these people clearly know that fertilizer works because they got the returns already, but they still don't use it. So it was clear that the information was important, but not very important. Even more strikingly, if you take they had asked beforehand, who are the people do you talk to about farming? So all the people who they were connected to, none of those people increased their fertilizer usage by even a little bit when this happened. So notice what has happened. There's a bunch of people who got free fertilizer. They used it, they made a lot of money. Next year, did they use fertilizer? Well, a few of them did, but not a lot. Did any of their friends use fertilizer because your friend used it and benefited? None of them did. So somehow information didn't seem to be the problem. It wasn't that they didn't know about it. Clearly, even the people who clearly knew about it didn't seem to. So what could be the answer? Well, one answer could be that people, if you ask people, do you want to get fertilizer? They always say yes. But then when you ask them, did you get fertilizer? They say no. And when you ask them why, they say, well, we didn't have any money. But that answer by itself doesn't make sense. Why? Because it doesn't take a lot of money to get fertilizer. Fertilizer is something that's, as I said, is divisible. Even if let's say you don't have enough money for the whole plot, you can get fertilizer for half your plot or quarter your plot. So they clearly they were earning enough to do that. So it turns out that, so they thought about it for a while, and then they thought, okay, here's one possibility. One possibility is that the timing is exactly wrong. So these people have seasonal crops. They get the money in, let's say, March. Then there's a dry season, and it rains again in July. They have to plant again. And by the time they get to July, they have just spent the money. So they were offered, so the NGO actually offered them the following intervention. So if this is the right theory, that basically people can't hold on to money for that long, then the right answer is, let's offer them to buy fertilizer at harvest time and for delivery at planting time. So you buy now, get later. Turns out they were very keen on that. And that's the one thing that really worked. It really changed the fertilizer usage rates. Got it up to 80%. So you could actually get 80% fertilizer usage. Finally, you broke the back of the problem. So they kept trying different things. It was only when they realized that they kept hearing people saying, yes, I want it, I don't have enough money. And after a while, they realized what that means. That means that they really needed help holding on to the money effectively. And when they figured that out, they could actually design an experiment that actually tested that, and they got very successful results. So in some sense, the key here is not that they got the answer to this question, though it's good that they did, but that this process was completely not possible with historical data. How could you do it? Each step by step, historical data, I'll observe that people didn't use it. And I could make some hypotheses, but there's no way I would be able to break it down step by step and keep trying things till I get to the answer. So in some sense, this is a process that was entirely facilitated by there being an experiment. Okay. So now that I've made for the case for experiments, let me try to address some of the criticism of experiments. I think one of the things to remember is experiments can't do everything. For example, I don't recommend randomizing the exchange rate. I don't think that would be a good idea. I don't think countries should start randomly setting exchange rates. So sometimes, if you look at India in a few years ago, you could say that they might have been trying that. However, it's not clear what makes us able to set good exchange rates. I think that it's not clear that there is any methodology that does it. We seem to basically guess at these things. Indeed, it may well be better. So part of the reason why we have to guess